In 1930, if you owned a Packard, you owned the world. It was more expensive, more prestigious, and more engineered than anything from Europe. Today, its factory is a 3 million square foot crime scene of rotting concrete. It wasn't a bad market that killed them. It was a cold-blooded corporate suicide. Today, we're dissecting the blueprint of how greed destroys perfection. We'll uncover the fatal merger that buried an empire and why giants like Boeing and Mercedes are making the exact same mistake right now. 35 million square feet of shattered concrete, twisted rebar, and asbestos-laced dust. For over 6 decades, this skeletal monolith stood on Detroit's East Grand Boulevard, casting a long, rotting shadow over the city. You could walk for miles through its cavernous, graffiti-scarred halls and hear nothing but the wind whistling through broken glass, the steady drip of rainwater, and the crunch of debris underfoot. To the urban explorers and scrappers who roamed here, it was just another casualty of the Rust Belt. A sprawling graveyard of American industry left to be reclaimed by nature. But this wasn't just a factory. This was a crime scene. The site of one of the most spectacular, self-inflicted corporate suicides in capitalist history. What died on these assembly lines wasn't just a brand. It was the absolute pinnacle of American automotive royalty. To comprehend the sheer, dizzying magnitude of this collapse, you have to rewire your understanding of luxury. Rewind to a time when the world looked to Detroit not for mass-produced appliances, but for uncompromised perfection. In the Roaring '20s, if you were the Tsar of Russia, an oil baron, or a Hollywood god like Clark Gable, you did not buy a Mercedes-Benz. And you certainly did not buy a Cadillac. In that golden era, Cadillac was for the newly rich, the upstarts still desperately trying to prove they had arrived. Packard was for the people who owned the world and had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. Let's put the brutal financial reality of this prestige into perspective. Imagine the year is 1930. A beautiful, brand-new, 3-bedroom home in a desirable American suburb would cost you roughly $4,000. A custom-bodied Packard Twin 6 V12 demanded a price tag of up to $10,000. You weren't buying a vehicle, you were acquiring a rolling estate. These machines were engineered with the silent precision of a Swiss bank vault, wrapped in hand-formed steel that was thicker than modern armor, and upholstered in the finest leathers and sheepskin money could source. The arrogance of the brand was so absolute, it was breathtaking. They didn't brag about horsepower in their advertisements. They didn't need to. Their entire marketing strategy consisted of a single, quietly devastating 6-word challenge to the rest of the automotive industry. Ask the man who owns one. Because if you had to ask the price, you couldn't afford it. And if you sat behind the wheel, you already knew there was nothing else on earth that could touch it. So, how does an empire that builds chariots for emperors end up as a desolate, wind-swept ruin? The comfortable, sanitized lie taught in business schools is that the market shifted. That foreign competition killed them, or that they were a victim of changing consumer tastes. That is a myth. Packard survived the Great Depression. They survived 2 world wars. What they could not survive was the rot that started from within the executive suites. This is a story about the death of quality at the hands of the spreadsheet. It is a terrifying blueprint of what happens when suits in the boardroom, blinded by the allure of mass market volume and short-term quarterly profits, take a sledgehammer to a century of meticulously curated trust. The stakes of this collapse went far beyond a lost trademark. This was a betrayal on a monumental scale. A betrayal of the elite buyers who trusted the crest, and a horrific betrayal of the generations of proud, blue-collar craftsmen in Detroit who poured their blood and sweat into building the finest machines on the planet. The bean counters decided that true, handcrafted luxury was too expensive, too slow, and too inefficient. They looked enviously at the soaring sales volumes of cheap, disposable cars rolling out of rival factories and got greedy. They convinced themselves they could sell the prestige of the Packard name on a budget chassis, bleeding their own brand equity dry in a desperate cash grab. But chasing the middle class wasn't the fatal blow. The greed was just the underlying disease. The actual murder weapon was a signature on a contract. A desperate, blind panic that led Packard's brilliant financial minds to merge with a company that was secretly hemorrhaging cash, a dying, bloated behemoth drowning in hidden debt. They tied a golden anchor to their own neck and proudly ordered the ship full speed ahead off a cliff. In the span of just a few agonizing years, the undisputed standard of the world was reduced to pasting fiberglass fins onto ugly, outdated bodies, becoming a national laughingstock before unceremoniously shutting its doors forever. Before we uncover the exact moment Packard's executives swallowed the poison pill, take a look at the luxury vehicles on the road right now. Tell me in the comments down below, which modern premium auto brand do you think is making this exact same fatal mistake today, trading its legendary reputation for cheap mass production? Because to understand exactly how a luxury empire destroys itself tomorrow, you first have to understand how Packard achieved absolute, untouchable perfection yesterday. And that terrifying obsession with perfection didn't start in a corporate boardroom. It started with a broken car, a furious engineer, and an insult that changed automotive. In 1898, the automobile was not a symbol of luxury. It was a loud, dangerous, and filthy novelty for eccentric rich men. James Ward Packard, a highly successful and stubbornly meticulous electrical engineer from Warren, Ohio, decided to purchase one of these new contraptions, a carriage built by the Winton Motor Carriage Company. It was an unmitigated disaster. The Winton broke down constantly. Its crude mechanicals vibrated violently enough to rattle teeth loose, and it frequently stranded Packard in the mud. But James Packard was not a man who simply complained to customer service. He was an engineer. He sat down, drafted a highly detailed, brilliantly calculated list of mechanical improvements, and took them directly to the office of Alexander Winton himself. Winton, a man of massive, fragile ego, looked at the quiet engineer with undisguised contempt. He sneered, delivering a line that would echo through industrial history. "If you are so smart, Mr. Packard, why don't you build a better machine yourself?" It was meant to be a humiliating dismissal. Instead, it ignited a maniacal, decades-long obsession. Packard didn't just accept the challenge, he weaponized his pride. He returned to his workshop and engineered a vehicle that made Winton's carriages look like crude, medieval torture devices. By 1899, the first Packard automobile rolled out onto the dirt roads of Ohio. It featured a revolutionary automatic spark advance and a steering mechanism that was light years ahead of the tiller-steered death traps of the era. It was incredibly smooth, ruthlessly reliable, and possessed a terrifyingly high build quality. The legend was born not out of corporate strategy, but out of pure, spiteful, uncompromising perfectionism. To truly understand the psychological weight of the Packard ethos, you have to look at the temple where these machines were forged. In 1903, the company relocated to Detroit, commissioning the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn to construct the massive East Grand Boulevard plant. It was the first reinforced concrete automobile factory in the world. But to call it a factory is an insult to what actually happened inside those walls. This was a cathedral of industry. The sharp, metallic tang of hot steel and cutting fluid mixed with the rich, heavy scent of imported English leather and aged wood. The men who walked through those massive iron gates every morning at dawn weren't just tightening bolts on a disposable product. They were automotive artisans. Generations of Detroit families, fathers bringing their sons, and eventually their grandsons onto the floor, worked those lines, bound by a fierce, undeniable blue-collar dignity. They operated under a philosophy that simply does not exist in today's ruthless, cost-cutting corporate spreadsheets. There was no such thing as an acceptable failure rate. The concept of planned obsolescence would have been treated as absolute heresy. The wood selected for a Packard dashboard wasn't a cheap veneer glued over plastic. It was thick, hand-selected burled walnut, aged perfectly and polished by human hands until it looked like dark, liquid glass. The load paths in the chassis were meticulously calculated by men with slide rules to withstand collisions that would instantly pulverize ordinary cars. The interiors were tailored, not just stitched, using heavy imported broadcloth, thick lamb's wool carpets, and the softest hides money could buy. They built these land yachts with the grim, unyielding determination of men constructing bank vaults. But the true soul of a Packard wasn't the plush leather or the gleaming chrome. It was the mechanical heartbeat hidden beneath the heavy steel hood. In 1915, Packard dropped an engineering earthquake on the automotive world, the Twin Six. It was the first production V12 engine on the planet. While rival companies were building crude 4- and 6-cylinder blocks that vibrated themselves to pieces at high speeds, Packard's chief engineer, Jesse Vincent, designed a masterclass in thermodynamic and rotational balance. The sheer mechanical harmony of the Twin Six was uncanny, almost ghostly. It produced a relentless, surging wave of torque that was so profoundly smooth, it defied the primitive physics of early 20th century motoring. When you drove one, you didn't feel an engine working, you just felt the world moving backward. Salesmen at upscale dealerships across the country would perform a mesmerizing parlor trick to close deals with skeptical millionaires. They would start the massive V12, pop the hood, and balance a nickel perfectly on its edge directly on top of the running engine block. The coin wouldn't even quiver. It was calm-made metal in a world of mechanical chaos. Let's dive into the deep tech of why this worked. Because it wasn't magic, it was over-engineering, bordering on insanity. Packard engineers obsessed over horizontal homogeneity in their ride quality and vertical affinity in their structural integrity before those terms even existed. They utilized nitride-hardened crankshafts that were virtually immune to wear. They machined tolerances so impossibly tight that the engine blocks seemed to be carved from a single, solid block of iron. They engineered suspension geometries with near-zero scrub radius, so the massive, heavy steering wheel could be turned with a single finger, completely isolating the driver from the brutal realities of unpaved roads. Even the vacuum wipers were over-engineered to operate silently, sweeping rain away without the irritating mechanical clatter found in lesser vehicles. By the Roaring '20s, the Packard crest was the ultimate global status symbol. You could not buy this kind of respect with marketing. It had to be earned through relentless, indisputable mechanical supremacy. European royalty began shipping Packards across the Atlantic because their local Rolls-Royces suddenly felt a bit too fragile and underpowered by comparison. Japanese Emperor Hirohito maintained a fleet of armor-plated Packards. Chicago gangsters like Al Capone favored them because the colossal V12s could outrun the police, and the bodywork was thick enough to deflect small arms fire. Hollywood moguls, Wall Street titans, and old money aristocrats, they all drove Packards. The social hierarchy of the American road was brutally clear. To be seen in a Cadillac in 1928 meant you were doing very well for yourself. You were a successful doctor or a rising executive. But to be seen stepping out of a custom-bodied Packard meant you owned the hospital the doctor worked in, and you sat on the board that hired the executive. General Motors knew it. The suits over at Cadillac agonized over it in smoke-filled boardrooms. They launched multi-million-dollar R&D programs, desperately designing their own V16 engines, burning through cash just to crack the invisible ceiling Packard had built over the American luxury market. But Packard remained completely untouchable, perched on a throne of cash, looking down on a scrambling Detroit. They were the undisputed kings of the road, heavily insulated by their vast wealth and their unyielding commitment to the craft. They believed, with the absolute arrogance of an apex predator, that their reign would last forever. But invincibility is a very dangerous illusion. In October 1929, the stock market imploded. The roaring 20s ended in a deafening chorus of shattered glass, shuttered banks, and jumping brokers. The Great Depression wrapped its hands around the throat of the American economy and squeezed. Overnight, the people who could casually afford a $10,000 custom V12 evaporated. The ultra-luxury car market didn't just shrink, it died. The carnage in the high-end automotive sector was absolute and merciless. Packard's fiercest rivals, the legendary 3 Ps of American luxury, Peerless and Pierce Arrow, began to drown in their own debt. Peerless, seeing the writing on the wall, stopped building cars altogether and ripped out their assembly lines to brew Carling Black Label beer. Pierce Arrow, a brand that once rivaled Packard for presidential prestige, bled out slowly, painfully, and filed for bankruptcy, completely wiped off the map. Inside the heavily fortified walls of the East Grand Boulevard plant, the atmosphere turned toxic with panic. The flawless engineering, the hand-polished walnut, the unshakable V12s that could balance a nickel, absolutely none of it mattered if there was no one left with the cash to buy them. The master craftsmen on the factory floor, men with grease permanently stained into their hands, watched the order books dry up, terrifyingly aware that their generational livelihoods were hanging by a thread. If the plant closed, their families starved. It was that simple. Upstairs in the executive suites, the men in the tailored suits were backed into a dark corner. They had massive overhead, a sprawling, power-hungry factory, and a workforce of thousands demanding paychecks. Survival required cash flow, and cash flow required volume. They looked at the corpses of Pierce Arrow and Peerless and realized that clinging to absolute, uncompromising perfection was going to drag them straight into the abyss. They needed a lifeline. So, they looked down from their ivory tower at the desperate, struggling masses of the American middle class. And they looked at their sacred, untouchable Packard crest, a symbol of uncompromised excellence that took 30 years of blood and engineering genius to build. They realized they could monetize that prestige. They could sell the illusion of wealth to people who weren't actually wealthy. Before we uncover the specific, fatal decision they made, think about the luxury brands you idolize today. If your favorite ultra-premium brand suddenly panicked and started selling plastic, half-price knockoffs of their own products in a discount superstore just to make a quick buck, would you ever respect them the same way again? Let me know down in the comments. What brand comes to mind first? Because Packard's executives thought they could outsmart the market. They thought they could print money by cheapening their own name without the rich noticing. And in doing so, they opened the door to an infectious corporate greed that was about to rip the soul right out of Detroit, setting the stage for a betrayal so profound it would destroy the greatest car company. The lifeline the executives grasped in the dark depths of the Great Depression was not a reaffirmation of their unyielding standards. It was the 1935 Packard 120. To the untrained eye, it looked like a Packard. It carried the iconic tombstone grille, the gleaming cormorant hood ornament, and the red hexagon on the hubcaps. But look closer, and the compromises were glaringly, painfully obvious. This was not of the spoke, handcrafted rolling palace built for a Vanderbilt. It was a mass-produced, mid-priced car stamped out on a mechanized assembly line, aimed directly at the upper middle class. A custom Packard Senior Series car could easily command $4,000, $5,000, or even $7,000. The new 120? It rolled off the dealer lot for $980. The psychological shift inside the East Grand Boulevard plant was seismic. The bean counters, the men in the tailored suits who stared at ledgers instead of blueprints, had finally wrested control from the master engineers. The decree came down from the executive suites: streamline, standardize, and cut costs. The thick, hand-rubbed, burled walnut on the dashboard was replaced by painted metal stamped to simulate wood grain. The heavy, sound-deadening English broadcloth was swapped for standard industrial upholstery. The obsessive, millimeter-perfect tolerances that required hours of hand-fitting by seasoned craftsmen were loosened to allow for the sheer speed of a moving assembly line. From a purely short-term, cold-blooded financial perspective, the 120 was an absolute, undisputed triumph. It was a spectacular infusion of adrenaline straight into the dying heart of the company. In 1935, Packard sold over 24,000 120s, utterly dwarfing the sales of their traditional ultra-luxury senior cars. By 1937, fueled by the introduction of an even cheaper six-cylinder model, they were pushing over 100,000 units out the factory doors. The cash was flowing again. The factory was saved. The boardroom was popping champagne, toasting their own brilliant business acumen. They had successfully monetized the prestige of their own name. But volume is a hell of a drug, and the executives were blinding themselves to the toxic side effects. They had just administered a slow-acting, lethal poison to their own brand equity. Think of it like this. Imagine if, tomorrow morning, Rolex decided they needed to boost their quarterly revenue. So, they introduce a digital plastic watch. They slap the iconic golden crown logo on the dial and sell it in the checkout aisle of your local supermarket for $50. For the first 12 months, the financial results would be staggering. They would make billions. Every middle-class teenager and office manager would rush out to buy a piece of the Rolex prestige. The accountants would be hailed as geniuses. But what happens in year 2? The Wall Street banker, the CEO, The celebrity who was preparing to spend $30,000 on a solid gold Daytona suddenly pauses. They look at the teenager bagging their groceries, wearing a watch with the exact same logo. And they turn around, walk out of the Rolex boutique, and buy a Patek Philippe instead. Because true high-end luxury is not merely about build quality or heritage. It is about exclusivity. It is about the absolute guarantee that you will not see the item you just mortgaged your ego to buy in the hands of the ordinary public. Packard's executives had traded a century of unassailable prestige for a quick hit of cash. And the wealthy elites, the core demographic that gave the brand its power in the first place, began to notice. When World War II ended in 1945, the American economic landscape transformed into a hyper-capitalist utopia. The Depression was a ghost. The country was flush with unprecedented wealth. Savings bonds were being cashed out, and the upper class was desperate to flaunt their money again. This was the moment Packard needed to violently pivot. This was the moment to kill the cheap cars, return to their roots, and re-establish themselves as the absolute pinnacle of luxury. But the executives were addicted to the easy money of the mass market. They looked at the post-war boom not as a chance to reclaim their crown, but as an opportunity to sell even more cheap cars. They doubled down on the middle class. The engineering department, once a sanctuary for automotive gods, was now tightly leashed by budget committees demanding shared platforms, thinner gauge steel, and cheaper stamping processes. Worse, Packard's styling became bizarrely conservative, bordering on geriatric. While the rest of Detroit was preparing for the jet age, Packard released their post-war redesign in 1948. It was a massive, bulbous, heavy-looking machine with no distinct beltline. The automotive press, always eager for blood, cruelly dubbed it the pregnant elephant or the bathtub Packard. It looked like a car designed for a retired banker whose only thrill in life was a Sunday drive to the country club. Meanwhile, over at General Motors, Cadillac smelled blood in the water. They unleashed their legendary head of design, Harley Earl, and told him to build the future. Cadillac didn't just build cars. They built pure, unadulterated American arrogance in steel form. They introduced the first mass-produced overhead valve V8, an engine that made Packard's aging straight-eights look like museum relics. They slapped massive chrome bumpers on the front and introduced the world to the tail fin, directly inspired by the twin tails of the P-38 Lightning fighter plane. Cadillac was selling speed, sex, and the space age. The contrast was devastating. The fatal blow to Packard's image came when the bean counters, desperate to keep the assembly lines moving at maximum capacity, authorized the sale of fleet vehicles, specifically taxicabs. Picture the scene in 1950. A wealthy industrialist steps out of his Wall Street office. For 20 years, he has only ever been driven in a custom Packard. He climbs into the back of his $10,000 luxury land yacht. The chauffeur pulls away from the curb, and they stop at a red light. The industrialist looks out his window, and idling directly next to him is a yellow, scuffed-up city taxicab. And bolted to the hubcaps of that cab is the exact same red hexagon. The exact same cormorant hood ornament sits on the grille. The humiliation was visceral. The illusion of exclusivity shattered into a million pieces on the pavement. Quietly, without fanfare, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Hollywood royalty, and the old money elites handed the keys of their Packards to their staff, walked into a General Motors dealership, and bought a Cadillac. The king was dead, the crown had been passed, and Packard had handed it over willingly for a few years of middle-class sales volume. By the early 1950s, the sugar high of the cheap cars wore off, and the hangover was catastrophic. The brutal reality of the automotive industry set in. Ford and General Motors engaged in a ruthless, scorched earth price war, flooding the market with cheap, mass-produced cars. The independent automakers were caught in the crossfire and slaughtered. Packard's cheap models were suddenly too expensive to compete with a Chevy or a Ford, and their luxury models had been so severely stripped of their prestige that no self-respecting millionaire would be caught dead in one. The boardroom on East Grand Boulevard descended into a state of absolute, blinding panic. Sales were in free fall. The massive factory was operating at a fraction of its capacity, bleeding cash every time the lights were turned on. The executives realized, far too late, that they had cannibalized their own legacy. They couldn't go back to the mass market, and the luxury buyers wouldn't have them. They were trapped in the middle, the most dangerous place to be in corporate America. They needed a miracle. They needed a corporate titan, a ruthless visionary who could step in, clean house, and resurrect the brand from the ashes of their own incompetence. So, the board of directors made a desperate phone call. They hired a man named James Nance to be the new CEO. But they didn't hire a seasoned automotive veteran. They didn't hire an engineer who understood the soul of a machine. They hired a man whose entire career expertise was mass marketing refrigerators, stoves, and washing machines for hot point appliances. James Nance walked into the Packard boardroom with a mandate to save the company at any cost. And he was about to sign a legally binding document that wouldn't just fail to save the company, it would actively, maliciously drag it down into a financial grave so deep the brand would never see the light of day again. Before we look at the catastrophic terms of that signature, I want to ask you a question. We've all seen great companies ruin their own reputation to make a quick buck. Think about the tech products, the clothing brands, or the tools you use every day. Tell me in the comments below, what is the most legendary product you used to love that completely destroyed its own quality just to sell to the masses? Because James Nance, the appliance salesman, was about to look at Packard's bleeding balance sheet and decide that the only way to survive a war with General Motors was to chain his dying. James Nance stepped into the executive suite of the East Grand Boulevard plant in 1952, carrying the supreme, unearned confidence of a man who didn't know what he didn't know. The board of directors had brought him in to perform a miracle. They looked at his resume and saw a corporate savior. He had been the president of Hot Point, where he had successfully moved millions of refrigerators, electric stoves, and washing machines into post-war American kitchens. He was a master of modern marketing, a disciple of high-volume sales, and a ruthless corporate optimizer. But there is a fundamental psychological chasm between selling a household appliance and selling an automotive legend. A washing machine is a utility. You buy it to perform a chore. A Packard was supposed to be a coronation. It was an emotional purchase driven by ego, status, and an unspoken guarantee of superiority. You cannot market a bespoke luxury vehicle using the exact same playbook you use to push a discounted toaster oven. But Nance, a true suit in every sense of the word, didn't care about the romance of the assembly line. He only cared about the geometry of the spreadsheet. When Nance took the reins, the American automotive landscape was transforming into an active war zone. General Motors and Ford were engaged in a brutal, scorched earth price war. Ford, desperate to dethrone Chevrolet as the #1 selling car in America, had ramped its factories up to maximum capacity, flooding its dealerships with inventory and forcing dealers to slash prices just to move the metal. General Motors instantly retaliated, weaponizing its massive economies of scale to match Ford dollar for dollar. This price war was a bloodbath for the independent automakers. Companies like Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, and Packard simply did not have the sheer financial mass to absorb those kinds of margin cuts. Their showrooms turned into morgues. Buyers who might have considered a mid-priced Packard 120 suddenly found they could buy a fully loaded Oldsmobile or Buick for significantly less money. Nance surveyed the carnage and realized that Packard was bleeding out from a self-inflicted wound. The brand was violently schizophrenic. In the exact same showroom, a dealer was trying to sell a cheap, mass-market sedan to a middle-class accountant, while simultaneously trying to sell a bespoke, coach-built limousine to a multi-millionaire. It was corporate madness. Nance's first major move was actually entirely correct. He tried to amputate the cheap cars from the luxury brand. He decreed that the lower-priced models would be stripped of the Packard name and sold solely under the name Clipper. Packard would, once again, be reserved exclusively for the ultra-wealthy. It was a brilliant strategy on paper, but in reality, it was 5 years too late. The damage was already deeply metastasized. The wealthy elites had already migrated to Cadillac, and the middle-class buyers, confused and insulted that their cars were suddenly stripped of the prestigious Packard crest, stopped buying the Clipper. Sales went into a terrifying freefall. In 1953, Packard built nearly 90,000 cars. By 1954, production plummeted to just over 35,000. The cash reserves were vanishing. The massive Detroit plant, which required staggering volume just to keep the lights on and the furnaces burning, had become an immense financial liability. Nance realized that independence was no longer a badge of honor. It was a death sentence. To survive the GM and Ford juggernauts, the smaller companies had to combine their mass. Nash and Hudson had already seen the writing on the wall, merging to form the American Motors Corporation. Nance envisioned an even grander empire. He wanted to construct a Big Fourth to rival GM, Ford, and Chrysler. He envisioned a massive conglomerate covering every single price point. And to build this empire, he needed a partner. He set his sights on Studebaker. On the surface, Studebaker looked like the perfect bride. Based in South Bend, Indiana, Studebaker was a beloved American institution with a history dating back to making wagons for the Union Army in the Civil War. They had a sprawling dealership network, massive production facilities, and a reputation for daring, avant-garde design. Their Starliner coupes, penned by the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy, looked like sleek, low-slung fighter jets, while the rest of Detroit was still building upright, boxy sedans. Nance and the Packard board looked at Studebaker's styling, their brand recognition, and their production volume, and saw salvation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Studebaker would build the cheap cars to compete with Chevy and Ford. Clipper would compete with Pontiac and Dodge, and Packard would be freed up to wage a holy war against Cadillac and Lincoln at the very top of the food chain. In June 1954, the executives gathered in a wood-paneled boardroom. Cigars were smoked, hands were shaken, and the Studebaker Packard Corporation was officially born. James Nance was named president. The press hailed it as a masterstroke. The stock market reacted with cautious optimism. But there was a catastrophic, unforgivable flaw in this monumental corporate marriage. In their sheer, blinding desperation to close the deal before the cash ran out completely, Packard's executive board and their high-priced lawyers had committed the cardinal sin of business. They had rushed the due diligence. They had trusted the rosy projections handed to them by Studebaker's management. They did not send their own ruthless forensic accountants to tear through Studebaker's books, walk the floors of the South Bend plant, and verify the math before signing the papers. They bought a used car without ever lifting the hood. Before we walk through the doors of that South Bend factory and uncover the horrifying financial nightmare Packard had just legally chained itself to, let me ask you to pause for a second. We've all seen massive corporate mergers billed as the next big thing that end up completely destroying the customer experience. Think about airlines, tech giants, or media companies. Let me know in the comments, what is the worst corporate merger in history that completely ruined a product you used to love? Because the moment Packard's internal auditors finally stepped off the train in South Bend, Indiana, and cracked open Studebaker's actual, unvarnished financial ledgers, the blood drained entirely from their faces. What they discovered was not a struggling automaker. They had discovered a financial black hole. Studebaker's public image of sleek, modern design was a glittering facade masking a rotting, archaic, industrial nightmare. The South Bend factory was a sprawling, inefficient disaster. Unlike the modern, single-story, continuous-flow assembly plants being built by GM and Ford, Studebaker's facilities were a chaotic maze of multi-story brick buildings. To build a single car, components had to be loaded onto slow, unreliable freight elevators, moved up and down multiple floors, pushed across open courtyards in the rain, and manually hauled between separate buildings. The logistics were a chaotic, money-burning catastrophe. But the archaic buildings were nothing compared to the true cancer eating Studebaker alive: their labor contracts. Studebaker's management, desperate to avoid strikes in the years immediately following World War II, had completely surrendered to the local union. They had instituted a piece rate pay system. In theory, workers were paid based on the number of parts they produced, which should have incentivized speed. But the union had completely co-opted the system, establishing extremely low daily quotas. A worker could hit their quota by lunchtime and then spend the rest of the afternoon sleeping, playing cards, or leaving the plant entirely, while still collecting a premium, full day's wage. Furthermore, the contract required the company to pay workers for downtime if the archaic assembly line stopped for any reason. And because the multi-story factory was so poorly designed, it stopped constantly. The result was a workforce that was being paid 15 to 20% more than the workers at General Motors, while producing vehicles at a fraction of the speed. The Packard accountants ran the numbers, and the final calculation was so horrifying it defied logic. In the automotive industry, survival is dictated by the break-even point, the exact number of cars you have to build and sell just to cover your immense overhead costs before you make a single dollar of profit. Because of the disastrous factory layout and the suicidal union contracts, Studebaker's break-even point was calculated at approximately 280,000 cars per year. The accountants then looked at the maximum red line capacity of the South Bend plant. If they ran the lines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pushing the machinery to its absolute breaking point, the factory could physically only produce a maximum of 250,000 cars a year. It wasn't just that Studebaker was losing money. It was mathematically, physically impossible for Studebaker to ever turn a profit. Even if they sold every single car they could possibly build, they would still lose tens of millions of dollars. Studebaker wasn't a partner. It was a terminal patient on life support, bleeding cash at a rate of $1 million a week. And by signing the merger agreement, Packard had just volunteered to supply the blood. James Nance had envisioned using Packard's remaining cash reserves, roughly $25 million, to fund a massive redesign of the luxury line, develop new, state-of-the-art V8 engines, and wage a technological war against Cadillac. Instead, that $25 million was sucked instantly into the Studebaker vacuum just to meet the South Bend payroll and keep the creditors from chaining the doors shut. The trap had snapped completely shut. The mighty Packard Motor Car Company, the brand that had engineered the Twin Six, the brand that had built the Liberty aircraft engines that helped win the First World War, the brand that kings and presidents had trusted with their lives, was now financially tethered to a sinking ship of Midwestern scrap metal. Panic mutated into absolute, paralyzing terror. The banks, realizing the horrific reality of the merged balance sheets, immediately cut off all credit. The Wall Street vultures began circling. Every single dollar of R&D money was frozen. The East Grand Boulevard plant in Detroit, the sacred cathedral where the finest craftsmen in America had polished walnut and stitched broadcloth for half a century, was suddenly staring down the barrel of an eviction notice. With the banks refusing to lend another dime, and the Studebaker abyss swallowing every cent of revenue, James Nance and the board of directors were backed against a wall. They had to make the most agonizing, soul-crushing decision in the history of the American automobile. To keep the corporation breathing for just one more fiscal year, they were going to have to commit a violent, unforgivable crime against their own legacy. They were going to have to take the legendary Packard nameplate, rip it off its throne. On June 25, 1956, the heavy iron gates of the East Grand Boulevard plant in Detroit swung shut, and a terrifying, unnatural silence descended upon the cathedral of American luxury. The furnaces went cold. The massive stamping presses, which had rhythmically pounded out the thickest, highest quality steel panels in the automotive industry for over 50 years, were powered down. Thousands of master craftsmen, men whose fathers and grandfathers had taught them how to perfectly stitch English broadcloth and hand-polish burled walnut, were handed their final paychecks and unceremoniously pushed out onto the street. They did not leave because their work was flawed. They were evicted because the executives who managed their brilliance had gambled it away on a bankrupt partner. The heart of Packard had been surgically removed without anesthesia. The company's independent identity was completely dissolved. James Nance, the appliance salesman who had orchestrated the catastrophic merger with Studebaker, was ousted in disgrace, leaving behind a smoking financial crater. But the corporation, now a bleeding, zombified husk, technically still existed. The bankers and creditors, desperate to recoup their massive losses, brought in a ruthless corporate fixer named Roy Hurley from the Curtiss-Wright Aviation Corporation. Hurley was not a carman. He was an executioner. His mandate was to slash overhead, liquidate assets, and violently squeeze every last possible drop of revenue out of the remaining dealer network. To do that, Hurley needed a car to sell for the 1957 model year. But he had absolutely no intention of spending a single dime to develop one. The brilliant engineering teams in Detroit had already been fired or had fled to Ford and General Motors. The bespoke Packard chassis, the proprietary V8 engines, and the ultra-luxury tooling were all locked away in the abandoned Detroit plant, left to collect dust. Production was forcibly relocated to Studebaker's archaic, crumbling brick facilities in South Bend, Indiana. The executives in South Bend faced an impossible, grotesque mandate: They were ordered to build a brand new, premium Packard to satisfy the legally binding contracts of their surviving dealerships. But they were given no engineers, no dedicated assembly line, and a development budget of practically zero. What followed was one of the most cynical, humiliating, and brazenly disrespectful acts of badge engineering in the history of global capitalism. The South Bend management took a cheap, mass-market Studebaker President sedan, a narrow, lightweight, mid-priced family car that was already struggling to compete with a basic Chevrolet, and they wheeled it into the design studio. The terrified designers were handed fiberglass, clay, and chrome, and told to somehow disguise this budget commuter car as a majestic, imposing Packard. It was a Frankenstein surgery performed with a dull hacksaw. The proportions were horrifyingly wrong from the very first sketch. A true luxury car of that era required massive width, a long, sweeping hood, and an undeniable physical presence. The Studebaker chassis was dangerously narrow and sat entirely too high. To hide this, the designers bolted cheap, hollow fiberglass tail fins onto the rear quarter panels, desperately trying to mimic the sweeping lines of the dead Detroit models. They slapped a wide, heavy, chrome-laden bumper onto the front, which jutted out awkwardly, making the car look like a small child wearing its father's oversized suit jacket. They glued the iconic Packard cormorant hood ornament onto the nose, bolted the red hexagon badges onto the hubcaps, and stuffed the interior with the leftover, cheaper materials from the discontinued Clipper line. When the 1957 models rolled into the few showrooms that hadn't already defected to Cadillac, the reaction was not anger. It was absolute, unfiltered revulsion. Imagine a titan of industry, a man who had purchased bespoke Packard V12s in the 1930s, walking into his local dealership to inspect the new model. He opens the door, expecting the heavy, bank vault thud of thick Detroit steel. Instead, he hears a hollow, metallic clatter. He looks at the dashboard and sees the cheap, stamped gauges of a Studebaker. He walks around the rear of the car and taps on the massive fins, expecting solid metal, only to hear the dull, plastic thwack of cheap fiberglass. The automotive press, smelling the blood of a dying king, showed absolutely zero mercy. They completely obliterated the car in print. They refused to even call it a Packard. They coined a mocking, venomous nickname that instantly stuck in the public consciousness: the Packardbaker. It was the ultimate humiliation. It wasn't just a bad car, it was a profound insult to the intelligence of the consumer. The executives actually believed that the American elite were so incredibly stupid, so blindly loyal to a piece of metal shaped like a bird on the hood, that they would happily pay a massive luxury premium for a cheap Studebaker dressed in fiberglass drag. The market's response was immediate and violently unforgiving. Sales, which had already been in a terrifying freefall, completely evaporated. They managed to trick barely 4,800 people into buying a Packardbaker in 1957. Cadillac, meanwhile, sold over 146,000 cars that same year. But the sheer, unyielding arrogance of the boardroom was not yet exhausted. In 1958, rather than put the tortured brand out of its misery, they doubled down on the grotesque. If the 1957 model was a tragedy, the 1958 model was an active hallucination. Desperate to follow the new trend of quad headlights sweeping Detroit, but completely lacking the funds to stamp new sheet metal, the designers literally grafted bulbous fiberglass pods onto the front fenders to hold the extra lights. They ripped the front grille open, creating a massive, gaping, fake fish mouth intake that looked like a deep-sea mutation. They bolted even larger, more disproportionate fins onto the rear. The 1958 Packard Hawk, supposed to be a sporty luxury coupe, featured a plastic, fake leather armrest bolted directly onto the exterior of the door. It looked like a car designed by a committee of blindfolded men who actively hated the company they worked for. The dealerships became ghost towns. Salesmen refused to stand next to the cars on the lot out of sheer embarrassment. The name Packard, which once whispered absolute, untouchable supremacy in the ears of global royalty, was now the punchline of jokes on late-night television. You could practically hear the roaring laughter echoing from the executive suites of General Motors in Detroit. Cadillac had won. Not by engineering a superior machine, but simply by standing perfectly still while their greatest rival repeatedly stabbed itself in the chest. By the summer of 1958, the bleeding could no longer be sustained. The Studebaker Packard Corporation was drowning, and the parasitic Packard badge engineering experiment was costing more to produce than it was bringing in. There was no press conference. There was no solemn eulogy for the brand that had dominated the first half of the 20th century. On July 13, 1958, a rather ugly, poorly proportioned sedan rolled off the assembly line in South Bend, Indiana. A worker turned off the lights. And that was it. 60 years of uncompromising automotive majesty erased by 5 years of executive greed. The death of the brand was quiet, but the physical wreckage it left behind was colossal. Taking a cheap commuter car, slathering it in plastic, and trying to sell it at a premium price is a boardroom trick that continues to plague the auto industry today. Before we step into the terrifying aftermath of this collapse, I want you to think about the cars on the road right now. What is the most insulting, heavily overpriced example of badge engineering you have ever personally witnessed? Let me know in the comments below, because while the Packard name was erased from the dealerships, the ghost of its arrogance could not be so easily swept under the rug. 300 miles away from the Studebaker plant, the massive 35 million square foot East Grand Boulevard factory still stood in the heart of Detroit. The executives had locked the gates and walked away, abandoning the largest manufacturing facility on Earth. But what exactly happens to a monument of that staggering, impossible scale when the money disappears and when a corporation vanishes? It usually leaves behind nothing but a quiet trail of shredded paper and deactivated server farms. But when the Studebaker Packard Corporation finally abandoned the East Grand Boulevard plant in Detroit, they left behind a corpse so unfathomably massive that it possessed its own weather system. Over 3.5 million square feet of reinforced concrete, glass, and steel, the cathedral of American craftsmanship was instantly transformed into the largest monolithic tombstone in the industrial world. The executives who locked those heavy iron gates in 1956 simply walked away, returning to their country clubs and their next board positions, entirely insulated from the physical rot they had engineered. But the city of Detroit was forced to live with the rotting carcass of their failure every single day for the next 6 decades. Nature and desperation took the plant back with terrifying speed. Without the heat of the massive stamping furnaces, the extreme Michigan winters immediately began to freeze and shatter the water lines. The legendary Albert Kahn architecture, engineered to withstand the vibrations of thousands of heavy machines, was no match for the slow, creeping violence of neglect. The sprawling, mile-long assembly lines where generations of artisans had meticulously hand-fitted burled walnut and polished chromium were plunged into absolute necrotic darkness. Scavengers descended on the carcass like vultures, ripping miles of copper wiring from the walls like pulling veins from a dead leviathan. The hand-laid brick courtyards where presidents had once toured the facilities became a toxic dumping ground. Over the decades, arsonists set hundreds of fires inside the cavernous halls, baking the concrete until it spalled and collapsed. Trees violently ripped their way through the roofs of the executive offices. For 60 years, this sprawling, apocalyptic ruin stood as a physical, unignorable monument to the supreme arrogance of the spreadsheet. It was a terrifying daily reminder to every auto worker in Detroit. This is what happens when the men in the suits decide your craftsmanship is no longer cost-effective. The sheer footprint of the decay was the exact physical dimension of top management hubris. But here is where the tragedy of Packard fractures into a suffocating, almost hallucinatory irony. While the factory that birthed them crumbled into toxic dust, the machines themselves violently refused to die. If you want to understand the absolute, unbridgeable chasm between the cowardice of corporate management and the immortality of true engineering, you do not look at the ruins of Detroit. You go to the manicured, impossibly green lawns of the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. Walk past the velvet ropes today, and you will see the survivors. A 1934 Packard 12 Dietrich convertible Victoria rolls onto the grass, the sunlight catching the flawless, mirror-deep nitrocellulose lacquer. Listen to it. There is no clatter. There is no grinding. Nearly a century after it was bolted together by men whose names are lost to history, the colossal V12 engine fires on the very first rotation, settling into a velvet, whispering idle so smooth you can still balance a silver dollar on the cylinder head. The billionaires, the tech titans, and the old money aristocrats crowd around these machines, speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Judges in tailored blazers scrutinize the microscopic stitching on the imported English broadcloth. The auctioneer's gavel strikes like a gunshot. $2 million, $3 million, $4 million for a single automobile. These buyers are not purchasing transportation. They are spending vast fortunes to acquire a ghost. They are buying a physical manifestation of an era when "Made in America" meant an absolute, terrifying refusal to compromise. They are fiercely bidding on the exact same over-engineered, painstakingly handcrafted perfection that James Nance and his board of directors explicitly decided was too expensive to maintain. The men who engineered these cars, the grease-stained craftsmen who poured their souls into the metal, achieved absolute immortality. Their work is preserved in climate-controlled vaults, worshipped as the highest form of industrial art. The executives who fired them, the men who desperately chased the mass market, the men who thought they could trick the public by gluing fiberglass fins to a cheap Studebaker, they achieved nothing but bankruptcy, humiliation, and the total annihilation of an empire. Yet the most dangerous part of this story isn't the death of Packard. The most dangerous part is that the boardroom disease that killed them was never eradicated. It was highly contagious, and it has mutated. What happened on East Grand Boulevard wasn't an isolated historical anomaly. It was patient zero for a corporate virus that has actively infected the highest echelons of modern global manufacturing. It is the insidious, incurable delusion that you can mass-produce prestige. You see the exact same necrotic rot happening today when a legendary German automaker, a brand that built its unassailable, bulletproof reputation on million-mile diesel sedans engineered by fanatics, decides to boost its quarterly earnings by slapping its sacred silver star onto a front-wheel drive, plastic-clad compact car with an engine borrowed from a French budget brand. You see the virus mutating when an American aerospace titan, a company once entirely ruled by brilliant, obsessive engineers who pushed humanity into the jet age, violently shifts its corporate culture to appease Wall Street shareholders. They fire the engineers, promote the bean counters, outsource the crucial assembly to the lowest global bidder, and suddenly, catastrophic failures become normalized, and passenger jet doors are violently blowing off in midair. The executives in these modern glass towers suffer from the exact same fatal arrogance as the men who killed Packard. They stare at a century of accumulated consumer trust, a reputation forged in blood and steel, and they do not see a legacy to protect. They see a battery. They see a massive reserve of goodwill that can be slowly, quietly drained to artificially inflate the stock price for the next 2 quarters. They always believe they are the first geniuses to discover the magic trick. They believe they can relentlessly cheapen the materials, thin out the steel, replace the leather with synthetic vinyl, blind the consumer with marketing jargon, and rely entirely on the lingering power of the badge to keep the sales volume pumping. They operate on the assumption that the consumer is inherently stupid. But the consumer is not stupid. The market always wakes up. The hangover always arrives. And when the illusion of exclusivity finally shatters, when the millionaire in the bespoke suit realizes he is driving a vehicle constructed with the exact same cost-cutting philosophy as his neighbor's cheap commuter car, the trust evaporates instantly. And trust, once betrayed at the absolute highest level of the market, can never be bought back. You cannot discount your way back into prestige. The spreadsheets always win the argument in the boardroom because the heavy financial cost of over-engineering is painfully visible on today's ledger. But the catastrophic cost of a ruined reputation won't show up on the balance sheet until the current CEO has already taken his multi-million-dollar golden parachute and left the building. Packard wasn't a mistake. It was a blueprint. Right now, in a sleek, climate-controlled boardroom in Stuttgart or Munich or Detroit, another team of high-priced executives is staring at a legendary badge on a projection screen. They are looking at the terrifyingly high cost of building something truly magnificent. And they are looking at the massive, incredibly lucrative, gullible middle class. They are gripping their pens, preparing to sign the exact same death warrant. They are preparing to trade their soul for volume. As you watch these legacy empires quietly strip away the craftsmanship, digitize the driving experience, and sell their history to the highest volume bidder, the terrifying question isn't how Packard died. The question is, which untouchable premium titan of industry is quietly bleeding to death on a factory floor right now, completely unaware that the cancer is terminal? Who is the next Packard? What happens when the people buying their cheapened plastic illusions finally wake up and realize they've been conned by a badge? Let me know down in the comments right now. Which iconic, legendary brand is actively committing corporate suicide at this very second? And how long until their factory door